One of the best atheist arguments would be the simplicity of atheist philosopher Oppy's naturalism. But what is this argument? Why is it so strong, and why is it considered the best argument against the existence of God? For that, a small definition of these two must be given.
What is naturalism?
Naturalism says that there is no supernatural entity that is outside the universe, or any entity in general that is supernatural and has a relationship with the universe. And theism defines the opposite, that there is a supernatural being that is essentially necessary and that sustains the entire universe. In this way, it is necessary to take these two positions and compare them. And when comparing them, Oppy says that we realize that there is no data that naturalism does not explain in the same or better way than theism. For example, we can take the data of the existence of the universe. Theists use the existence of the universe to justify or argue the existence of God in this way. Theists can say that God is a necessary being, but Oppy really says that atheists or naturalists can argue that the universe itself is necessary and that God is not needed. Also, another example could be the contingency argument, which says that God is a necessary being because he is the first cause. But what if the universe in an initial state was the first cause and not God? In this way, we can say that naturalism returns to be on an equal footing, or at least equal footing, with theism. Another thing would be the fine adjustment of the universe that says that the universal constants would have been otherwise, the world would not exist, and that for the same reason there must be an order, and that order must have been proposed by a mind, an intelligent mind outside the universe. But Oppy says that all this can be explained through chance. In this way, we can say that theism and naturalism are on an equal footing. But here Oppy comes and says, okay, but our explanation is much simpler, that is, apply the Occam razor, then says that any simpler explanation is the most plausible, it is the most credible. But why would it be simpler? Well, theists always have to appeal to one more entity, to an entity that is God. On the other hand, naturalism does not have to add one more entity, but that one more entity remains. It is much simpler, since the universe can explain itself in a simple way. On the other hand, theism has to appeal to a God, to one more entity, and for the same reason it would no longer be simple, it would not be much less simple than naturalism. In this way, applying Occam's razor, we could say that it is much more reasonable to believe that God does not exist through naturalism than to believe that God exists through theism. But theism has not been silent on this argument.
In fact, one of the most important branches of theism, or I would say the most important and the most relevant, not only during the Middle Ages but also today, with defenders as good as Edward Fessler, has had an answer to the simplicity of theism. Naturalism.
I'm talking about classical theism. In fact, it's quite curious because classical theism was the inventor of this argument practically. Yes, in fact, Thomas Aquinas had already raised this argument in the Summa Theologica long before Oppy.
And we find it in the first part, question 2, article 3 of the Summa Theologica.
In that part, curiously, where he raises his famous 5 ways, an objection is raised very similar to the objection that Oppy raises to theism.
He says that nature can explain itself and that there is really no need to appeal to a God, and since it is a simpler explanation, it is better to prefer the first option, that is, that nature explains itself, than that the explanation be God.
But hey, let's move on to the response from theism, specifically classical theism.
This answer is based on 2 concepts that classical theism has, which is the definition of act and power, and also, clearly, that there are hierarchies in beings, that is, that there are things that are more perfect in essence than others.
And well, the first answer is that the ultimate reality of classical theism is much simpler than the ultimate reality of naturalism.
What is the ultimate reality?
It is the first cause, and it is what entirely sustains everything that exists. According to naturalism, what sustains everything that exists is the universe itself, since there is nothing else that is outside the universe.
But really, the universe is not simpler than God.
Because
the universe is made up of a lot and depends on a lot more compounds than God.
Because
the universe depends on matter, on space-time, and these more contain many more compounds than could be in matter, for example, atoms, and that depends on the structure of the atoms, which are electrons, orbitals, neutrons, and all of that, every little thing that we only have, only taking into account only one dimension of the universe, which would be matter, has a lot of things that, well, it depends on many more things. It is not that the universe only depends on one thing, but that it depends on a lot of things for which it would not be simpler. But classical theism only depends on a single being that is absolutely simple in this way, as it has no compound and only depends on one being and does not depend on many beings. We can say that classical theism is much simpler than naturalism. And for the same reason, naturalism by having to consider everything in the universe, which depends on many things, on many atoms, and those atoms depend on the structure of those atoms that have neutrons, electrons, orbitals and many more things. And not only there is one type of particle, there are many types of particles that are used for many things, and these types of particles have more structures, and these structures reach other structures, and those others reach others until reaching the simplest particle, which is the one that depends on all. We can say that classical theism is much simpler since it only depends on a single being. What sustains the entire universe is a single being, and that is absolutely simple, that it does not depend on a lot of beings. But the naturalist can argue that the fundamental reality should not really be taken into account, but everything in the universe and what exists. And I could say that, anyway, naturalism would be much simpler since it implies one less being. But again, the theist can hand the card back and say, well, you're right, but guess what? Theism still wins, and it doesn't need to be any simpler. Because according to the theist, the first subsistent being must be necessary, and without it another hierarchy cannot exist, because without the subsistent being contingent beings could not exist, and for this reason the naturalist would reach the same conclusion if it were not for a fault in his logic. That is to say that if there could be, for example, chickens without atoms, which is impossible, the philosopher Enrique Fgel gives a very good example with chickens and atoms. Imagine seeing two naturalists arguing, saying, well, there are chickens, but there are also atoms. The other naturalist says, well, but really that's not simpler. It's really much simpler to say that only chickens exist, but that's practically impossible. Why? Because chickens depend on atoms. For the same reason, he would not have to convince the other naturalist that because his theory is simpler it should be the true one. Why? Because according to his theory there can be no chicken without atoms. The same is true of neoclassical theism, or even classical theism, which really posits that without God the entire universe cannot exist. So we can accept that naturalism is much simpler than classical theism or any type of theism, but that is not why it is more true, because it is at the cost that the naturalistic theory is incoherent. It is at the cost of saying that, for example, chickens could exist without atoms. And really what should be discussed is not which is the simplest, because the simplest is not necessarily the correct one, but which is the most coherent. And in order to have to defeat classical theism, one would not have to say that naturalism is simpler, but rather that classical theism is incoherent. And for that one would have to raise objections to classical theism, rather than raising which is the simplest. It is absurd to propose chickens without atoms, just as it is absurd to propose matter or the universe without God, at least until the contrary is proven. All this can be found in the paper Occam on the Side of the Angels, or Occam on the Side of the Angels, by the philosophers Tyler McNabb and Michael DeVito. In this way we would be ending the video. I hope you like it, and remember, always be theists or even atheists or agnostics from reason.